The crossing. The troop ships left North Africa in July 1943, packed with men who expected to die at sea. They had surrendered in Tunisia 2 months earlier. Rommel's Afrika Korps, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had collapsed under the weight of Montgomery's Eighth Army and Patton's advancing Americans. Tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers marched into Allied cages in May 1943, hands raised, faces gray with exhaustion and defeat. The desert campaign was over. What came next, no one knew. Heinrich Matthias, 23 years old, from a small village outside Hamburg, assumed he would be executed. He had been taught that Americans and British did not take prisoners seriously. The propaganda films showed chaos, mob justice, casual brutality. Obergefreiter, corporal. Matthias had fought through France in 1940, then been transferred south for Rommel's North African adventure. He knew how to fix tank engines. He had never killed anyone face to face, and now in the summer heat of an Oran holding pen, he waited for the bullet or the noose. Instead, they loaded him onto a ship, 2 weeks at sea. The Atlantic in summer, swells and salt air. Hammocks below deck, tight quarters, the hum of engines. The men whispered, some prayed, others played cards with makeshift decks. There was food, not much, but regular. Bread, some kind of stew, water. No one beat them. No one threw them overboard. It made no sense. On August 4th, 1943, the ship docked at Norfolk, Virginia. They filed off the gangway onto American soil. Heinrich expected a mob. Angry faces, thrown rocks, spitting crowds. There was nothing. Dock hands worked cranes. Soldiers in clean uniforms gestured them toward waiting trucks. The air smelled different. Less dust, more green. Trees lined the distant hills. Then came the train. Heinrich and the others expected a slow freight line. Cattle cars, maybe. The kind used to move livestock or coal. What pulled into the station was a sleek passenger train, windows intact, upholstered seats, overhead luggage racks. They boarded in silence. For 2 days, the train moved west and south. Through Virginia's farmland, across North Carolina's Piedmont, into Tennessee, then Mississippi. The prisoners sat by the windows, watching America scroll past. Fields of corn taller than a man. Barns painted red. Small towns with church steeples and paved roads. Cars. So many cars, parked along streets, ordinary people driving to work or market. One prisoner, Hans Kleine, a Feldwebel, sergeant, from Bavaria, would later write, "We saw no signs of war, no ruins, no craters. The countryside looked fat, as if the war were happening on another planet." The train arrived at Camp Clinton, Mississippi, 2 days after leaving Norfolk. The prisoners climbed out into humid summer air, cicadas screaming in the pines. Barbed wire encircled rows of wooden barracks. Guard towers stood at the corners. It looked like every temporary military camp Heinrich had seen in training. Except cleaner, newer. They were led to the mess hall for dinner. And that's when everything Heinrich thought he knew began to crack. First night, American soil, Camp Clinton, Mississippi. Wooden barracks, barbed wire, and a dinner that made no sense. The mess hall was a long, low building with screened windows and ceiling fans that turned slowly overhead. Rows of tables, benches. American soldiers in cook's whites ladled food onto metal trays as the prisoners shuffled through the line. Heinrich picked up his tray, expecting watery soup or a piece of hard bread. Oatmeal, or maybe it was something else. some kind of grain cereal, milk to pour over it, sugar in a bowl white and granular, scrambled eggs still steaming, bacon crisp and fatty, toast with butter, coffee, black and bitter but real, not the acorn substitute they'd been drinking for 2 years. A small glass of orange juice. Heinrich sat down. He looked at his tray, then at the men around him. Everyone sat in the same frozen confusion. Hans Kleene, seated across from him, whispered, "Das ist eine Falle." This is a trap. The logic was clear. Feed them once, well, then starve them, or poison them slowly, or fatten them for some unknown purpose. But the guards ate from the same kitchen. The American soldiers at the next table had the same food. Heinrich ate. Slowly. The eggs tasted like eggs. The bacon was salty and rich. The coffee burned his throat. When he finished, he waited for his stomach to cramp, for dizziness, for some sign of poison. Nothing. That night, lying on a clean bunk with a wool blanket and a pillow, Heinrich wrote a letter home. The censors would read it, he knew. But he wrote the truth anyway. They fed us eggs and bacon as much as we could eat. I do not understand. He would mail that letter. It would take 4 months to reach Hamburg. His mother would read it and weep, not from relief, but from disbelief. She would write back, "You must have made a mistake. Or perhaps you are trying to protect me from the truth. Tell me what is really happening." But there was no mistake. The next morning, breakfast was the same. Lunch brought meat, pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, and a slice of pie. Dinner, chicken, rice, carrots, more bread, milk. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a medical officer from Hamburg, who had been captured alongside Heinrich, began keeping notes. He had been trained to document, to observe. In his careful handwriting, he recorded what the prisoners ate. Then he recorded what happened to them. The men who arrived were malnourished, he would later write. Scurvy, pellagra, vitamin deficiencies. After 6 weeks of American rations, they began to gain weight. Skin conditions cleared, energy returned. After 1 year, they were healthier than they had ever been. But health was not the only thing that changed. In the barracks at night, the prisoners talked. "Why would they feed us this way?" someone asked. "Geneva Convention," another said. "They have to." But this is more than the convention requires. This is more than we fed our own soldiers. Silence. Because that was the truth no one wanted to say aloud. In 1943, a German soldier in the Wehrmacht received rations that, on paper, totaled around 3,000 calories per day. In practice, supply lines were stretched. The Eastern Front consumed everything. By 1943, soldiers were often hungry. Civilians in Germany were rationed to 1,200 calories a day, sometimes less. And here, as prisoners, as enemies, they ate until they were full. The scale of imprisonment. By 1945, the United States held 371,683 German prisoners in 46 states and 700 camps. This was not a handful of men in a corner somewhere. This was an infrastructure, a system. Base camps, branch camps, work camps scattered from Texas to Minnesota, from California to Virginia. Tens of thousands of men behind wire, processing through a machine that the American government had built specifically to handle the overflow of captured Axis soldiers. Camp Hearne, Texas, 10,000 men. Camp McCain, Mississippi, 4,800. Camp Como, Camp Clinton, Camp Shelby. Camp Algona, Iowa, 10,000 more. The numbers multiplied. Every state had at least one camp. Some had dozens. The prisoners were housed in barracks, segregated by nationality and sometimes by ideology. Hardline Nazis in one section, anti-Nazis in another. The U.S. government learned quickly that mixing the two led to violence. Men beaten in the night, quiet murders disguised as suicides. The camps were not idyllic. They were prisons, but they were prisons governed by rules. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners of war be fed the same rations as the captor nation's soldiers. The United States complied, more than complied. By 1944, German POWs in American camps consumed an average of 3,200 calories per day. American soldiers received about the same. German civilians, by contrast, were rationed to roughly 1,200 calories daily, and in the bombed cities, often less. Here are the numbers documented by the U.S. War Department. 371,683 German POWs held in the United States by 1945, 700 camps across 46 states, 3,200 calories per day, average prisoner intake, 1,200 calories per day. Average German civilian ration, estimate, 45 cents per hour paid by farmers employing POW labor to offset costs. The prisoners received 3 meals daily. Breakfast, oatmeal or cereal, eggs, bacon or sausage, toast, butter, jam, coffee with cream and sugar. Lunch, meat, beef, pork or chicken, vegetables, potatoes or rice, bread, dessert. Dinner, more meat, soup, vegetables, bread, coffee. On Sundays, turkey or chicken with all the traditional accompaniments. Feldwebel Hans Kleene, writing from Camp McCain, described it in a letter home. We receive oatmeal or cornflakes with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, coffee with cream. For lunch, meat, always meat, with vegetables, potatoes or rice, bread, and a dessert. For dinner, more meat, more vegetables, soup, bread, and coffee. On Sundays, we get chicken or turkey. His letter reached Germany in early 1944. His family thought he had been forced to write propaganda for the Americans. They could not reconcile his words with the reality of rationing, hunger, and the queues for bread in Munich. But the scale was real. The United States, in the middle of fighting a two-ocean war, feeding its own troops and supplying the Soviet Union and Great Britain through Lend-Lease, still had enough surplus to feed over 370,000 enemy prisoners, better than those men had eaten in years. The men who came. They were not fanatics. They were mechanics, farmhands, and teenage conscripts. The popular image of the German POW in America is often shaped by films and propaganda. The sneering SS officer, the hardened paratrooper, the true believer in Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. Some of those men existed in the camps, but they were the minority. The majority of German prisoners in the United States were ordinary soldiers, conscripts, men who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1941 or 1942, sent to North Africa or Italy, and captured when their units collapsed. The average age was 22. Many had never fired a shot in combat. Others, like Heinrich Matthias, were skilled laborers, tank mechanics, drivers, radio operators. They came from small towns, villages in Bavaria, farms in Saxony, working-class neighborhoods in Hamburg and Berlin. Before the war, they had been apprentices, students, factory workers. Some had joined the Hitler Youth not out of conviction, but because everyone else did. It was normal, expected. Now, In 1943 and 1944, they found themselves in Texas, Mississippi, Kansas, and Nebraska. Their pre-war lives had been shaped by the aftermath of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, hyperinflation in the 1920s, the Great Depression. Many had grown up with fathers who were unemployed, families that struggled. When Hitler came to power in 1933 and the economy began to recover, jobs returned, infrastructure rebuilt, it seemed like a miracle. That's what Heinrich remembered. Not the rallies or the rhetoric, but the fact that his father, a machinist, had steady work again. Then came the war, and the propaganda. The Reichswehr and the lie before capture, they believed America was weak, divided, and starving. Nazi propaganda had been thorough. From 1933 onward, the German people were told a clear and consistent story about the world. Germany was strong. Germany was pure. Germany was rising from the ashes of humiliation. The enemies, the democracies of the West, were corrupt, decadent, and doomed. America, in particular, was portrayed as a nation in collapse. The Great Depression, which had indeed devastated the U.S. economy in the 1930s, was presented as ongoing and terminal. Breadlines, unemployment, chaos. The propaganda films showed starving children, homeless families, industrial decay. The message, democracy doesn't work. Capitalism devours itself. Only the Führer's vision could save a nation. There were other lies, layered on top. America was weak because it was mongrel, a racial mixing pot with no unifying identity. Its military was incompetent, its soldiers soft and undisciplined. Jews controlled the banks, the media, the government, siphoning resources and manipulating the masses. The Soviet Union would crush the Americans if they ever met in battle. For Heinrich Matthias and Hans Kleine and tens of thousands like them, these ideas were not questioned. They were the background hum of daily life, repeated in schools and newspapers, on the radio, in the barracks. You didn't have to be a fanatic to absorb them. You just had to be there. So when Heinrich was captured in Tunisia, he expected to find the America of the propaganda films. Weak, divided, starving. Instead, he found Brookshire's grocery in Bryan, Texas. Camp Hearne, Texas, 10,000 men behind wire, building their own small Germany, until payday came. In October 1943, Heinrich Matthias and 2,000 other prisoners were transferred from Mississippi to Texas. The train ride took 36 hours. They arrived at Camp Hearne, a sprawling compound 60 miles northwest of Houston, surrounded by cotton fields and pine forest. The air smelled different here, drier, hotter, with a faint sweetness from distant refineries. Camp Hearne was designed to hold 10,000 men. By late 1943, it was nearly full. The compound covered over 700 acres, divided into 3 sections. Compounds for enlisted men, a separate area for officers, and administrative buildings staffed by Americans. Inside the wire, the Germans ran their own affairs. They elected camp leaders, organized work details, formed orchestras and sports teams. There was a library, a theater, even a small newspaper printed in German. It was a strange kind of prison, structured, orderly, almost mundane. The barracks were identical to those at American training camps, wooden, whitewashed, with screened windows and electric lights. Each man had a bunk, a footlocker, a shelf. The latrines had running water. The showers worked. But the strangest thing was the money. Every prisoner who worked, and most did, once they adjusted, received wages. Not real dollars, but scrip, camp currency, printed specifically for POWs. The rate was set by the War Department, 80 cents per day for labor. A private received 10 cents per day just for existing. A corporal like Heinrich earned slightly more. At first, the script seemed like a joke. What could you buy with camp money in a prison? Then the canteen opened. Camp Hearne's canteen operated 6 days a week, stocked by the camp administration and supplied through civilian contractors. By 1944, the inventory was astonishing. Coca-Cola at 5 cents per bottle, Hershey's chocolate bars for 10 cents, Lucky Strike cigarettes for 15 cents per pack, chewing gum, razor blades, soap, toothpaste, stationery, even Kodak film for the handful of prisoners who owned cameras. Each prisoner could spend up to $15 per month in scrip, equivalent to nearly 19 days' wages. For comparison, a German soldier on the Eastern Front in 1944 earned roughly 50 Reichsmarks per month, worth perhaps $10 at official exchange rates, but often unable to buy anything because supplies didn't exist. Here, in captivity, the shelves never ran empty. Heinrich bought a Coca-Cola on his first payday. He had never tasted Coca-Cola before. He twisted off the cap, took a sip. It was sweet, fizzy, cold from the icebox. He looked at the bottle in his hand, then at the rows of identical bottles stacked behind the counter. Hundreds of them. Thousands, if you counted the warehouse. Hans Kleine, still at Camp McCain, would write in a letter, "They give us Coca-Cola, while they fight us." It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But the Coca-Cola was real. The candy bars were real. The soap, the cigarettes, the stationery to write letters home. All real. At night, in the barracks, the prisoners talked. Some insisted it was a trick, a form of psychological warfare designed to make them soft. Others argued it was proof of American excess, wastefulness, decadence. A few, quietly, began to wonder if maybe the propaganda had been wrong. The first shopping trip. Brookshire's, April 1944. The moment propaganda met produce. Not all prisoners were allowed outside the wire. Only trustees, men who had demonstrated cooperation, who had signed agreements not to escape, who were deemed low risk, could leave the camp under guard for work details or occasionally for supervised errands. Heinrich became a trustee in March 1944. His mechanical skills made him valuable. He repaired trucks, farm equipment, generators. The guards knew him. He was quiet, reliable, not a troublemaker. In April, a corporal from the motor pool asked if he wanted to come along to town. They needed parts for a tractor. Heinrich said yes. 8 prisoners, 1 American guard, a deuce-and-a-half truck. They drove into Bryan, Texas on a Saturday afternoon. The town was small, maybe 15,000 people, with a main street lined with storefronts, hardware store, drugstore, bank, diner, and Brookshire's grocery. The guard parked the truck. "You've got 20 minutes, he said. "Stay together. Don't wander off." They walked toward the hardware store first, but Heinrich saw the grocery. Plate glass windows, clean and bright. A sign above the door, Brookshire's. "Can we go in there?" he asked. The guard shrugged. "Sure, just don't steal anything." Heinrich pushed open the door. A small bell chimed. Cool air conditioning, though he didn't know the term yet, washed over him. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. And then, the shelves. Rows. Endless rows. Canned vegetables stacked floor to ceiling, peas, corn, beans, tomatoes. 10 brands, 20 varieties. Flour in paper sacks. Sugar, despite the rationing posters on the wall. Fresh meat behind glass, refrigerated, hamburger, pork chops, chicken, sausage links, milk in glass bottles, butter in waxed paper, eggs in cardboard cartons, bread, sliced and wrapped in wax paper, stacked in bins, chocolate bars, chewing gum, cereal boxes with bright colors and cartoon mascots. Heinrich stopped walking. He just stood there, staring. Behind him, another prisoner whispered, "Mein Gott." The guard, bored, leaned against a display of canned soup. "You boys need anything?" Heinrich walked slowly down the aisle. He touched a can of peaches. He picked up a box of cornflakes. The price tag said 12 cents. 12 cents. He could afford that with one day's wages in camp scrip. Except camp scrip wasn't real money, and he was here in a real store where real Americans shopped. An old woman pushed a cart past him, nodding politely. She wore a clean dress and low-heeled shoes. Her cart held milk, eggs, a roast wrapped in white paper, a loaf of bread, a bag of apples. Heinrich thought of his mother, the ration cards, the queues, the rumors of black market butter at 5 times the legal price. He thought of the propaganda films. America starving, America collapsing, America on its knees. This was not that America. He walked to the meat counter. A butcher in a white apron stood behind the glass. "Help you, son?" Heinrich didn't speak much English. He pointed at the hamburger. "How much?" 25 cents a pound, the butcher said. Heinrich nodded, not buying, just understanding. A pound of meat, 25 cents. Less than a day's wages, even for a prisoner. He turned and walked back to the entrance. The other prisoners stood clustered near the bread aisle, silent, faces blank with shock. The guard checked his watch. Time to go. They filed out. The bell chimed again. They climbed into the truck and sat in the truck bed, not speaking, as the guard drove them back to camp. That night, Heinrich wrote another letter. "Today I saw a grocery store. I cannot describe it, you would not believe me. There was meat, fresh meat and milk and eggs and bread and candy all in one place. People walked in and bought whatever they wanted. I do not understand how this is possible." He mailed the letter. It would take months to reach Hamburg. His mother would read it and weep again, certain now that her son had lost his mind. Letters that changed nothing. They wrote home describing the abundance. Families in Germany thought they'd gone mad. The United States government censored all outgoing mail from POW camps, but the censorship was surprisingly light. The censors checked for military information, escape plans, coded messages. They did not generally censor descriptions of food, living conditions, or daily life. The Americans wanted the letters to get through. They wanted German families to know how well their sons and brothers were being treated. What the Americans didn't anticipate was that no one in Germany would believe the letters. Hans Klein, still at Camp McCain in Mississippi, wrote prolifically. His letters were detailed, almost obsessive. He described every meal. He listed the canteen inventory. He told his family about the movies shown on Saturday nights, the baseball games, the camp orchestra. He wrote about Americans he'd met, farmers who hired POW labor, guards who shared cigarettes, townspeople who waved from car windows. His sister, Maria, wrote back from Munich in late 1944. "Hans, we understand you must write what they tell you to write. We do not blame you. We know you are trying to protect us from worry. But please, if you can, send some signal that you are truly safe. We hear terrible things about what happens to prisoners." Hans wrote back, frustrated. "I am telling the truth. I have gained 15 kilos. I eat 3 meals a day, real meals, with meat and vegetables and bread. There is no trick. This is real. Maria's next letter. Hans, either you have been forced to write this or you have gone mad. There is no other explanation. Please be strong. The war will end soon, and you will come home. He stopped trying to convince her. Dr. Friedrich Bauer kept his medical notes, but he also kept a personal diary. In it, he wrote, "The men here are healthier than at any time since conscription. Scurvy has vanished. Dental problems are treated by American dentists. We have medicine, bandages, antibiotics when needed. And yet, when I write to colleagues in Germany describing these conditions, they respond with pity, assuming I have been broken by torture or propaganda. They cannot conceive that a nation at war would treat its enemies this well." The disconnect was total. On one side, prisoners living in relative comfort, eating well, working for wages, watching American films. On the other, families in bombed cities, queuing for bread, rationed to subsistence levels, believing their captured sons were starving in revenge camps. The letters kept coming, both directions, and neither side could convince the other. Work details. Farm labor, factories, lumber, and exposure to ordinary American lives. By 1944, prisoner labor had become essential to the American economy, particularly in rural areas. The war had pulled millions of American men into uniform. Farms, factories, and lumber camps faced severe labor shortages. The solution, German and Italian POWs, who could be contracted out under Geneva Convention rules, provided they were paid and not used for direct military production. In Texas alone, over 35,000 German prisoners worked in agriculture during the war. They picked cotton, harvested sugar beets, cut timber, processed food. Farmers paid the U.S. government 45 cents per hour per prisoner. The government, in turn, paid the prisoners 80 cents per day, regardless of hours worked. The difference covered administrative costs. Heinrich worked on a cotton farm outside Hearne in the fall of 1944. 6 days a week, a truck picked up 20 prisoners at dawn and drove them 15 miles to the fields. They worked under a single armed guard, who mostly sat in the shade and read magazines. The work was hard. Bent backs, raw hands, the Texas sun beating down. But it wasn't war. No one was shooting. And at the end of the day, they rode back to camp, ate dinner, and slept in real beds. What struck Heinrich most was the farmer. His name was Earl Thompson. He was 57, too old for the draft, and his 3 sons were overseas, 1 in the Pacific, 2 in Europe. He spoke little, but he wasn't cruel. At midday, his wife brought out lunch for the prisoners. Sandwiches, cold lemonade, sometimes pie. She served the Germans the same food she served her husband. One afternoon, Earl drove Heinrich into town to pick up parts for the cotton gin. On the way, they passed Earl's house, a white farmhouse with a porch, electric wires running from a pole, a car parked in the driveway, a radio antenna on the roof. Earl saw Heinrich staring. "You got a farm back home?" Heinrich understood enough English by then. "My father and small house, no car." Earl nodded. "Rough over there, huh?" Heinrich didn't know how to explain. That his father, a skilled machinist, had lived in a 2-room apartment. That before the war, a car was unthinkable. That electric lighting was common, yes, but everything else, everything Earl took for granted, was out of reach for most Germans. He just said, "Yes, rough." Earl Thompson wasn't rich. He was a tenant farmer, working land he didn't own. But he had a car, a radio, a telephone. His children had gone to school past age 14. His wife owned a washing machine. Heinrich had been taught that American workers were exploited, desperate, crushed by capitalism. Earl Thompson didn't look crushed. The myth fractures. 6 months in America, and the foundation of belief starts to crack. Not everyone changed. In every camp, there were men who clung to Hitler, to the party, to the belief that Germany would still win. They formed secret cells, held clandestine meetings, enforced loyalty through intimidation. Prisoners suspected of collaborating with Americans, or even of speaking favorably about them, were beaten, sometimes killed. The violence was real. But for many others, the cognitive dissonance became unbearable. Heinrich had been raised on certain truths. Germany was strong, disciplined, united. America was weak, chaotic, corrupt. Jews controlled everything. Democracy led to decay. The Führer was saving Europe from Bolshevism and Jewish finance. And yet, the grocery store shelves were full. The farmers had cars. The prisoners ate better as captives than they had as soldiers. American factories produced tanks, planes, ships in quantities that defied comprehension, and still had enough left over to fill every store, every canteen, every home with goods. Heinrich sat on his bunk one evening in late 1944, reading a letter from home. His mother described the bombing of Hamburg, the firestorm, the refugees flooding the countryside, the rations cut again, the rumor that the Wehrmacht was running out of fuel, ammunition, everything. And then he looked around the barracks. Electric lights, clean sheets, a footlocker full of soap, toothpaste, candy bars bought with his own wages. "We can't sign," he whispered to himself. "How can this be?" Hans Klein, in a letter from Camp McCain, wrote, "You're asking the wrong question, not how can this be, but what else were we lied to about? Because once you asked that question, everything unraveled. If the Americans weren't weak, weren't starving, weren't collapsing, if that was a lie, then what else was a lie? The Jews? The Bolsheviks? The inevitability of German victory? Some prisoners couldn't face it. They doubled down, insisted the abundance was fake, a movie set designed to break their will. Others quietly began to read the American newspapers provided in the camp library. They listened to the radio broadcasts. They asked the guards questions. The war inside, the war between what they'd been taught and what they'd seen, had already begun. Stalingrad and the news. February 1943. Newspapers reached the camps. Germany is losing. Heinrich had known about Stalingrad. Every German soldier knew. The Sixth Army encircled. General Paulus surrounded. The desperate airlift that failed. And then, in February 1943, silence. The propaganda back home called it a heroic sacrifice. The soldiers in North Africa, waiting for supplies that never came, knew it meant something worse. But Heinrich had been captured in May 1943, just 3 months after Stalingrad fell. The full scale of the disaster was still being hidden, distorted, reframed. The official story, a tactical setback, terrible but necessary, the army fighting to the last man in defense of civilization against the Bolshevik horde. It wasn't until late 1943, sitting in the Camp Hearne library with access to American newspapers and magazines, that Heinrich learned the truth. Over 90,000 German soldiers captured at Stalingrad. Estimates of total German and Axis casualties, dead, wounded, captured, exceeded 400,000 men. The entire Sixth Army gone. The photographs in Life magazine showed columns of ragged prisoners marching through the snow, faces hollow, uniforms in tatters. The articles described the siege, the rubble, the cold, the starvation, the rats. Heinrich read the articles slowly, his English improving each week. Then he read them again. He had assumed the losses were heavy. Every soldier assumed losses. But 400,000? An entire army erased? He looked up. Across the table, another prisoner, a man named Joseph, a former Hitler youth leader, was reading the same magazine. Joseph's face was rigid, unmoving. Propaganda, Joseph said quietly. American lies. Heinrich said nothing, but he kept reading. The camp received newspapers weekly, the New York Times, the Dallas Morning News, the Houston Chronicle. The Americans didn't censor them. Prisoners could read whatever they wanted, and the news, through 1944, was relentless. Kursk, another massive German defeat. Rome, fallen. The Soviets pushing west. Allied bombers over Berlin. The camp also had a radio. Once a week, the prisoners gathered in the mess hall to listen to broadcasts. The Americans provided German-language programs and news, music, commentary. Some prisoners refused to attend. Others came and listened in stony silence. In early 1944, the radio announced the Allied landings at Anzio, then the fall of Rome, then, in June, D-Day. Hans Kleene, still at Camp McCain, wrote in a letter to Maria, "The war is lost. I do not say this to be defeatist. I say it because I can see the numbers. I can see the maps. The Americans publish everything. There is no deception here. Germany is surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of time." Maria wrote back, "You have been poisoned by their propaganda. The Führer has secret weapons. The tide will turn. Do not lose faith." Hans didn't reply to that letter. Some prisoners felt despair. They had fought, believed, sacrificed, and for what? Others felt relief. If Germany was losing, the war would end sooner. They could go home. A few felt anger, betrayed by leaders who had sent them into an unwinnable fight. But the most common emotion was confusion. If Germany was losing this badly, why hadn't they been told? Why had the propaganda kept insisting victory was near? And if the propaganda lied about the war, what else had it lied about? The re-education program. The U.S. government tried to teach democracy. The supermarket did it faster. In 1944, the U.S. War Department launched the Intellectual Diversion Program, though it was later renamed, more honestly, the Re-Education Program. The goal was straightforward: transform German POWs into future democratic citizens. When they returned to Germany after the war, they would help rebuild the country on democratic principles rather than authoritarian or militaristic ones. The program included films, lectures, discussion groups, and books. Prisoners attended classes on American history, the Constitution, the structure of democratic government. They watched Frank Capra's Why We Fight series. They read translations of the Federalist Papers, Thomas Paine, and Lincoln's speeches. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the medical officer, attended several lectures out of curiosity. He found them earnest, well-meaning, and mostly ineffective. "The Americans assume that ideas change minds," he wrote in his diary. "They believe that if you explain democracy clearly enough, logically enough, people will embrace it. But that is not how belief works. Belief is not rational. It is emotional, cultural, rooted in experience. You cannot lecture a man into abandoning everything he was taught since childhood." The official statistics bore this out. By 1945, The War Department estimated that only about 15% of German POWs could be classified as reliably anti-Nazi or pro-democratic. Another 15% remained hardline Nazis. The remaining 70% fell somewhere in the middle, disillusioned, confused, or simply exhausted. But Dr. Bauer noticed something the official reports didn't measure. "The lectures change almost no one," he wrote. "But the food changes everyone. The men attend the film screenings not because they care about American democracy, but because there is free popcorn. They go to discussion groups because coffee and donuts are served. And slowly, imperceptibly, they begin to associate America not with political theory, but with material reality. Democracy is abstract. A Hershey bar is concrete." He continued, "I have watched men who despise the lectures still line up at the canteen to buy Coca-Cola. I have seen prisoners refuse to denounce Hitler, but also refuse to stop eating butter. The contradiction does not seem to trouble them. The butter is real. The ideology is increasingly distant, like a language they once spoke fluently, but are now forgetting." Heinrich attended exactly 2 re-education lectures. The first was about the American Constitution. The lecturer, a young army captain, spoke passionately about separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism. Heinrich understood maybe half the English. He left confused. The second lecture was about freedom of the press. The captain explained that American newspapers could criticize the government without being shut down, that journalists could investigate corruption, that citizens had a right to know the truth. Heinrich thought of the grocery store. He thought of Earl Thompson's farm. He thought of the letters his mother didn't believe. He didn't need a lecture to understand freedom. He could see it. Americans drove where they wanted. They bought what they wanted. They said what they wanted. He'd heard guards complain about Roosevelt, mock the president, criticize the war effort, all without consequence. That evening he told Hans in a letter, "The lectures are useless. They already showed us the grocery store was the lecture." Hans wrote back, "Democracy is not a system. It is a shelf full of butter." They both understood. You cannot argue with a full shelf. The holdouts. Not everyone surrendered their faith. Some men died for Hitler behind American wire. Joseph Winkler had been a squad leader in the Afrika Korps, a true believer, 26 years old, from Munich. He joined the Nazi Party in 1936, volunteered for military service in 1939. He had fought in Poland, in France, in North Africa. When captured, he gave only his name, rank, and serial number. He refused to cooperate beyond what the Geneva Convention required. At Camp Hearne, Joseph became a leader among the hardliners. They met in secret after lights out in the latrines or behind the barracks. They called themselves the Lager Gestapo, the Camp Gestapo. Their mission: maintain discipline, punish traitors, preserve loyalty to the Führer. A traitor, in their definition, was anyone who spoke favorably of America, anyone who attended re-education lectures willingly, anyone who worked too cheerfully on the farms, anyone who said the war was lost. The punishments varied. Minor infractions earned beatings. Serious betrayals earned death. In November 1944, a prisoner named Otto Baumann was found hanged in the Camp Hearne latrine. The official cause of death, suicide. But everyone in the compound knew the truth. Otto had attended a re-education lecture and afterward told another prisoner that maybe Germany had made mistakes, that maybe Hitler wasn't infallible. 3 days later, he was dead. The American camp authorities knew the Lager Gestapo existed. They tried to identify the leaders, segregate the fanatics from the moderates. But it was difficult. The hardliners operated in cells, silent and disciplined. Prisoners who might have informed were too terrified to speak. By mid-1944, the U.S. military began segregating camps. Hardline Nazis sent to separate compounds, Camp Alva, Oklahoma, became notorious as a collection point for the most extreme prisoners. Anti-Nazis and moderates were moved to different locations. The goal was to prevent violence and protect those who were genuinely disillusioned with the regime. But even with segregation, danger remained. Heinrich kept his head down. He didn't attend re-education lectures after the first two. He didn't speak openly about his doubts. When other prisoners talked politics, he stayed quiet. He worked, ate, wrote carefully neutral letters home, and waited. Hans, at Camp McCain, was less cautious. He argued with the hardliners. He said openly that the war was lost, that Germany had been lied to, that Hitler had driven the country into ruin. He made enemies. One night in January 1945, 3 men cornered him in the latrine. They didn't kill him, but they beat him badly enough that he spent 4 days in the camp infirmary. When he recovered, he was transferred to a different camp in Arkansas. "They wanted to silence me," he wrote to Heinrich. "They cannot accept that the dream is over. They would rather die believing the lie than live knowing the truth." Not all the holdouts were violent. Some simply withdrew, clinging privately to their faith. They refused to read American newspapers, refused to attend any camp activities, spent their days in silence. When the war ended, they wept. When Hitler's death was announced, some refused to believe it. Even in 1946, during repatriation, a handful of prisoners insisted the Reich would rise again. Dr. Bauer, ever the observer, noted in his diary, "Faith is resilient. It can survive starvation, defeat, even evidence, but it cannot survive comfort. The violent believers hold on because they have nothing else. The silent believers fade because the butter tastes good." In the end, America defeated Germany not with guns but with groceries. The economic miracle they witnessed. Continuous so. By 1944, the United States had become the arsenal of democracy in terrifying full force. American factories produced approximately 96,000 aircraft that year alone, fighters, bombers, transports, roughly 260 planes per day. Tank production for the entire war exceeded 88,000 units, with the Sherman tank assembly lines running at peak efficiency, some plants completing a finished tank every hour. Naval construction was even more staggering. 141 aircraft carriers, fleet and escort, over 800 major warships, and 5,200 merchant vessels were built during the war years. The Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan employed 42,000 workers and produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak output. Chrysler's tank arsenal covered 113 acres under one roof. Meanwhile, American steel production in 1944 reached 81 million tons, more than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. And yet, with all this industrial mobilization, American grocery stores remained stocked. Civilian car production resumed in late 1945 within months of war's end, and over 370,000 enemy prisoners ate 3,200 calories daily. The scale was incomprehensible. Heinrich read these figures in Life magazine, cross-checked them in the Saturday Evening Post. The magazines published them openly, proudly. There was no secrecy. America wanted the world to know. He tried to imagine the Willow Run plant, one bomber every 63 minutes. That meant the plant completed more bombers in a single day than Germany's entire aircraft industry sometimes completed in a week by late 1944. And this was just one plant. There were hundreds more. He thought about the Hamburg machine shop. 40 men, 300 units per month. Willow Run, 42,000 workers, thousands of bombers per year. The numbers didn't scale. They belonged to different universes. And this was the country that also filled Brookshire's grocery. The country that gave prisoners Coca.
The conditions were harsh, yet the spirit of the men remained unbroken. They found solace in these moments of shared community.
Cola for 5 cents. The country that had enough butter, meat, eggs, and chocolate to feed its civilians, its soldiers, its allies, and its enemies. Hans wrote from his new camp in Arkansas, "I finally understand why we lost. It was never close. We were fighting an economy that could do everything we could do, plus 10 more things, and still have enough left over to be generous. We fought a factory, and the factory won." Dr. Bauer's assessment was more clinical. Germany mobilized for total war and exhausted itself. America mobilized for total war and grew wealthier. The difference is not ideology, it is capacity. We had one economy. They had 50. Even the holdouts, the true believers, couldn't entirely ignore the evidence. Josef Winkler, the Lagergestapo leader, was heard muttering one evening, "They must have sold their souls. There is no other explanation." But Heinrich knew better. There were no devils, no bargains, just assembly lines, just farms that produced more than they consumed, just a system, whatever it was called, that worked so well it could fight a global war and still leave the shelves full. In April 1945, Heinrich was assigned to a work detail at a munitions depot. They unloaded crates of artillery shells, stacked them in warehouses. The crates came from factories in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. The shells inside were stamped with production dates: February 45, March 45, fresh, new, endless. Heinrich stacked the crates and thought about the Tiger tanks he'd repaired in North Africa. Beautiful machines, brilliantly engineered. But there were never enough of them. Always shortages, always waiting for parts. Here, there were too many shells. The depot couldn't store them fast enough. That night he told another prisoner, "We lost the war in 1941, we just didn't know it yet." Why 1941? Because that's when America started building, and once they started, we never had a chance. The end comes May 1945, VE Day. The war is over, but they remain. The news reached Camp Hearne on the evening of May 7, 1945. The camp commander, Colonel Harding, called an assembly in the main compound. 10,000 prisoners stood in loose formation as the late afternoon sun slanted across the parade ground. The air smelled of cut grass and distant rain. Colonel Harding climbed onto a wooden platform. He held a sheet of paper. His voice, amplified through a crackling loudspeaker, was steady and formal. "Effective tomorrow, May 8, 1945, at 11:01 p.m. Central European Time. All German armed forces will cease hostilities. Germany has surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. The war in Europe is over." Silence. Heinrich stood in the fourth row, hands at his sides. He felt nothing. Or perhaps he felt too many things at once, and they canceled each other out. Relief. Exhaustion. A strange, distant grief. Around him, reactions varied. Some men wept openly. Others stood rigid, faces blank. A few turned and walked away, shoulders shaking. One prisoner near the front collapsed to his knees. The colonel continued, Adolf Hitler is dead. He died by suicide in Berlin on April 30th. Grand Admiral Dönitz assumed leadership and authorized the surrender. More silence. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single voice. Lügner. Liar. But the voice was quiet. Defeated. Even the hardliners knew it was true. That night the camp was eerily quiet. No one played cards. No one sang the folk songs that sometimes echoed from the barracks. Men lay on their bunks, staring at the ceiling, or sat outside in small groups, smoking, not speaking. Heinrich walked to the edge of the compound and leaned against the fence. Through the wire he could see the lights of the guard towers, the distant glow of Hearne. Beyond that, darkness. Somewhere across that darkness, Germany was burning. Hans, now at a camp in Arkansas, wrote a letter that night. It is finished. I feel no victory, no vindication, only emptiness. For 6 years we were told to fight, to believe, to sacrifice. And now the men who told us those things are dead or hiding, and we are left with the bill. I do not know what comes next. Dr. Bauer recorded in his diary, the end came not with the climax, but a whimper. The prisoners expected to feel something profound, rage, relief, sorrow. Instead, they feel numb. Perhaps that is the only sane response to the revelation that everything they fought for was a lie. In the days that followed, the camp administration distributed more newspapers. The prisoners read about the liberation of concentration camps, photographs from Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, the skeletal figures, the mass graves, the gas chambers. Some prisoners insisted the photos were faked, Soviet propaganda, Allied lies. Others read in silence and said nothing. A few, quietly, admitted they had heard rumors during the war. Whispers about camps in Poland, transports of Jews heading east, orders no one talked about. They had chosen not to believe, or not to think about it. Heinrich looked at the photographs for a long time. He thought about the propaganda, the speeches about racial purity, the casual anti-Semitism that had been woven into every aspect of life. He thought about what he had ignored, what he had accepted as normal. He folded the newspaper and walked outside. He didn't know how to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had believed. So he didn't try. He just filed it away. Another impossible thing in a year of impossible things. Returning to Ruins 1946, they go home to a Germany that no longer exists. Repatriation began slowly. The first prisoners left American camps in late 1945, mostly the sick and wounded. The rest waited. By early 1946, the process accelerated. Ships carried thousands of men back across the Atlantic, reversing the journey they'd made 3 years earlier. Heinrich sailed from Norfolk in March 1946. The ship was crowded, the food less generous than in the camps, but adequate. The voyage took 12 days. Men stood on deck, watching the horizon, silent. They docked at Bremerhaven. What had once been a bustling port was now a landscape of rubble and twisted steel. Cranes stood frozen, half collapsed. Warehouses gaped open to the sky. The smell of ash and decay hung in the air. The Germany Heinrich returned to bore no resemblance to the country he had left. By 1946, Allied bombing campaigns and ground combat had destroyed approximately 70% of housing in major cities like Hamburg, Berlin, Cologne, and Dresden. An estimated 20 million Germans were displaced, refugees from the east, bombed-out city dwellers, returning soldiers. The infrastructure was shattered. 40% of the rail network was unusable. Bridges lay collapsed in rivers, and industrial production had fallen to 1/3 of 1938 levels. Food was scarce. The average German civilian in 1946 consumed between 1,000 and 1,500 calories per day, well below subsistence. Currency was nearly worthless. The black market operated on cigarettes and barter. An estimated 4 to 5 million German military personnel had died in the war, with millions more wounded or missing. The occupation zones, American, British, French, and Soviet, divided the country into separate administrative regions. The Germany Heinrich had known, the Germany he had fought for, no longer existed. He took a train from Bremerhaven to Hamburg. The train moved slowly, stopping frequently. Through the window, he saw towns reduced to rubble, fields overgrown, forests stripped for firewood, people walking along roads with suitcases and carts going nowhere in particular. Hamburg was worse. The train station was partially rebuilt, but the surrounding blocks were flattened. Entire neighborhoods gone. The streets were cleared of rubble, but the buildings were hollow shells, windows empty, roofs collapsed. Heinrich walked to his family's neighborhood. It took 2 hours. He passed displaced persons camps, soup kitchens run by the Allies, lines of people waiting for ration cards. The apartment building where he'd grown up was gone. Just a foundation and a pile of bricks. A woman sitting nearby told him the building had burned in the 1943 firestorm. His mother and sister had survived. They were living in a refugee shelter on the outskirts of the city. He found them 3 days later. His mother, 52 years old, looked 70, thin, gray, her hands shaking. She didn't recognize him at first. Then she did, and she wept. His sister, Greta, 20 years old, was harder. She had worked in a munitions factory during the war, survived the bombings, the occupation, the chaos. She looked at Heinrich with something close to anger. "You ate well," she said. "We heard. You ate butter and chocolate while we starved." Heinrich didn't argue. It was true. That night he gave them the packages he'd brought back. Canned goods, soap, coffee, chocolate bars bought with his last camp scrip, and smuggled past inspectors. His mother cried again. Greta took the food without a word. Heinrich tried to explain. The camps, the work, the grocery stores. But the words sounded hollow. How could he describe Brookshires to someone who hadn't eaten meat in 3 years? Hans returned to Bavaria and found his family's farm intact, but his father dead. A heart attack in 1944. His sister Maria was alive, married to a French soldier from the occupation forces. She didn't apologize for disbelieving his letters. She just hugged him and said, "You survived. That's enough." Dr. Bauer returned to Hamburg and resumed his medical practice. He treated malnutrition, tuberculosis, dysentery. He never published his diary, but he kept it. Years later, his son would find it and donate it to a university archive. The returning prisoners brought something back with them beyond packages and memories. They brought knowledge. They had seen a country that functioned. They had seen abundance, efficiency, infrastructure that worked. They had seen that another way was possible. Some kept quiet about their experiences, unsure how to speak about them without sounding like traitors or fools. Others talked openly, describing America to anyone who would listen. In the late 1940s, as the Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Germany, those conversations mattered. The prisoners who had seen American factories, American stores, American farms, became small voices advocating for change. Not democracy necessarily, that was still abstract, but for the material conditions that made abundance possible. The supermarket's legacy, Some returned to America decades later to say thank you. In 2017, a man named Gunter Grawe, 92 years old, traveled from Germany to Texas. He had been a prisoner at Camp Hearne in 1944. He had picked cotton on Earl Thompson's farm. He had walked into Brookshire's grocery in Bryan and seen shelves full of food. 73 years later, he wanted to return. A local historian arranged the visit. Gunter stood on the site of the old camp, now an empty field with a historical marker. He touched the metal plaque and closed his eyes. I was treated better here, as an enemy, than I had been treated in my own army, he said. I cannot explain it. It changed everything I believed. He visited a Brookshire's grocery, not the original, which had long since closed, but a modern supermarket in Bryan. He walked slowly through the aisles, leaning on a cane, touching the shelves. Still full, he murmured. Still full. He met with the family of Earl Thompson, the farmer who had employed prisoners. Earl had died in 1978, but his daughter remembered the German POWs. Daddy said they were just boys, she told Gunter. He said they worked hard and didn't complain. He felt sorry for them. Gunter wept. He gave us lunch. He gave us lemonade. He treated us like human beings. Other prisoners returned over the years. Not many, but a few. They came to see the camps, to visit the farms where they had worked, to find the stores they remembered. Some brought their children or grandchildren, trying to explain what they had seen, what it had meant. Most couldn't fully articulate it. The experience was too strange, too contradictory. They had been enemies, captives, and yet they had been fed, paid, treated with a decency that defied the logic of war. Dr. Bauer's son Marcus interviewed several former prisoners in the 1980s for a dissertation. He asked them what they remembered most. The food, one said. The waste, said another. They had so much, they could afford to waste it. The kindness, said a third. Not from everyone, but from enough people that it mattered. Marcus asked if the experience had changed their political views. The answers varied. Some said yes, they became Democrats, believers in the Western system. Others said no, they remained skeptical of all ideologies. But almost all agreed on one thing. We learned that we had been lied to, not about everything, but about enough that it broke something. You cannot unsee abundance. You cannot untaste butter. What the shelf taught a can of soup, a pound of butter, proof that ideology dies when fed. Heinrich Matthias lived quietly after the war. He worked as a mechanic in Hamburg, married in 1950, raised 2 children. He rarely spoke about his time as a prisoner. When asked, he would say only, I was treated well, better than I deserved. In 1962, he visited the United States for the first time as a free man. He attended a trade show in Detroit, representing the German company where he worked. On his last day, he rented a car and drove to a supermarket. He stood in the produce section for 10 minutes, just looking. The apples were stacked in perfect pyramids. The lettuce was crisp and green. The meat counter gleamed under bright lights. A woman approached him, concerned. Are you all right, sir? Heinrich nodded. Yes, I'm just remembering. He bought a can of peaches, the same brand he had touched at Brookshire's in 1944. He didn't eat them. He kept the can on a shelf in his workshop for the rest of his life. Hans Kleine became a teacher in Bavaria. He taught history. When his students asked about the war, he told them about the letters home that no one believed. He told them about the grocery store. He told them about the contradiction, that the country they had fought had fed them better than their own. Ideology, he would say, is a luxury of the well-fed. When you are hungry, ideology is just noise. When you are full, you can afford to think clearly. Dr. Bauer's diary was published in 1995, 50 years after the war. It became a minor academic resource, cited in dissertations on POW experiences. One passage is particularly well known. The re-education program failed because it tried to teach from the top down. Here are the ideas. Now believe them. But the grocery stores succeeded because they taught from the bottom up. Here is reality. Now decide what it means. You cannot argue with a full shelf. You cannot debate a pound of butter. America won the ideological war not with speeches but with abundance. The prisoners returned to Germany and said, "I have seen what is possible." That quiet sentence, repeated thousands of times, did more to reshape post-war Germany than any Marshall Plan lecture. By the 1950s, West Germany, rebuilt with American aid, adopting market economics and democratic structures, began its Wirtschaftswunder, its economic miracle. Factories hummed again, stores filled with goods. The standard of living rose rapidly. Some historians credit the Marshall Plan. Others credit German industriousness. But a few note the role of the 370,000 returning prisoners who had spent years in America, who had seen abundance firsthand, who knew it was possible. Heinrich, Hans, Dr. Bauer, and thousands like them didn't become activists or politicians. They just lived. They worked, raised families, built things. But they carried with them a memory that couldn't be erased. The memory of walking into a grocery store in Texas and seeing proof that everything they'd been taught was incomplete. Democracy is not a form of government. Not to the hungry. Democracy is the shelves staying full even during war. Freedom is not a constitutional clause. Not to the tired. Freedom is the farmer with a car, the prisoner paid for his labor, the store that never runs out. Ideology in the end is fragile. It collapses under the weight of a Coca-Cola bottle. It shatters when confronted with refrigerated meat. It dies quietly, without drama, when a man walks into a supermarket and realizes that everything he believed was a carefully constructed lie. Heinrich Matthias died in 1998, at the age of 78. In his workshop, on a shelf beside wrenches and oil cans, sat a rusted can of peaches, label faded, unopened. His grandson found it after the funeral. He asked his grandmother what it meant. She smiled, tired and sad. "It was the day he learned the truth," she said, "and the truth tasted sweet.